Good afternoon and welcome everyone back. I'm Dan Winter, as you know, fractalfield.com, fractalu.com. This is a very special event arranged by my partner Valerie and the Ananda Marga partners. And our special guest today is Dada Ravi, who is currently in Egypt and is teaching the Ananda Marga spiritual science around the world, yogi, and very in-depth and involved. Also, we have Tufan Guven with us to help moderate and explain any messy words and make it fun. So Dada has prepared an amazing presentation related to the spiritual science of Tantra. And my presentation has to do with the spiritual science of pyramids. And there is an interesting connection having to do with the pyramid, the fire amid the centripetal force that holds the aura in Tantra and that holds the aura in the pyramid, literally the fire within. And that interesting connection makes a beautiful bridge, as it were. And so without further ado, I'm turning this over to Dada, who is in Egypt. Go ahead, Dada. Welcome, welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan, and greetings to everyone. Greetings to Tufan, Valerie, and all our friends here. As Dan said, I'm in Egypt. I've been here for the last 3 weeks, and I particularly wanted to get Dan's input into this real science around the pyramids. Now, I joined a private tour at the Giza Plateau, as you know, pretty much every foreign person will do when they come to Cairo. And I got what Sam Osmanagich called on a recent video with Dan, the bedtime story version of what the pyramids in Giza are about. And I was very aware that it was a very official version. There's hundreds of tour guides there, and they're giving very much the same type of very simplistic sort of accounts of the pyramids. So we'd scheduled this call with Dan, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to, really get Dan's deep insight, scientific, fractal physics viewpoint on what's really going on with the Giza pyramids, and of course the many pyramids around the world. But before doing that, I will give in a sense, a related but a slightly different perspective, which is the overview of the Tantra spiritual science. My hope is that Dan can give some of his insights as I go through this big picture Tantra cosmology, and just to see what resonates with Dan regarding that, coming from his particular fractal physics negentropy viewpoint. So without further ado, if I can just jump straight into that, and Dan, if I may share the screen now.
Sure. Go right ahead. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, can people see that?
Yes, Tantra.
All right. So I'm going to start explaining very briefly a little about the history of Tantra. The word itself is made up of the word tan and tra. The word tra is signifying liberation. The word tan has two meanings. One is limitation, staticity, crudeness, in which sense Tantra means liberation from staticity, from limitation. The other meaning of tan is expansion. And in that sense, Tantra also means liberation through expansion. We're here talking about expansion of the mind. Okay, so that's the word. Now, the word was given by Shiva around 5000 BCE. That's around 7,000 years ago. So within this account, Shiva was definitely a living historic being, and who we think of today as the father, certainly the father of Tantra, but more generally the father of yoga and yogic science. Okay, so the account of Tantra that I'm giving really is coming from P.R. Sarkar, 1921 to 1990, who was the founder of the Ananda Marga organization, which is certainly the primary global organization that is based on and committed to teaching the Tantra Yoga spiritual science. P.R. Sarkar is also noted as being the creator of the Prout teaching, the progressive utilization theory, which is an alternative socioeconomic system. And you can check out anandamarga.org and proutworld.org. Okay, so jumping into the cosmology, in Tantra, it all starts with what we call supreme consciousness. Now in Sanskrit, that is referred to as Brahma, the word Brahma. And it can be taken as the supreme being or the supreme consciousness, the supreme entity. Now, one thing that's important to note here is when we're using the word consciousness in yoga, we're using it in the sense of spirit. So this could be taken as the supreme spirit or the supreme being. I know when Dan uses the word consciousness, as I see it, it's closer to the meaning of awareness. So I think in this sense, we're sort of probably emphasizing different things. According to our Tantra cosmology, this Brahma, this supreme consciousness, has two aspects. One of those aspects is, we call it supreme cognitive principle, or more simply put, cosmic consciousness. The second aspect of that one supreme consciousness we call supreme operative principle. And it's the combination of these two things that make up that one supreme being from the Tantra viewpoint. So a lot of what we're going to be actually talking about in this brief overview is actually the supreme operative principle, because it is through the operation of this operative principle that we get the creation. Literally, because that operative principle starts to operate on a part of cosmic consciousness and starts to literally metamorphose it into the forms that we find within the creation. And so let's take a closer look at this operative principle. So it is itself the composite of what we call the three gunas, these three gunas. In Sanskrit, they're known as sattva guna, raja guna, tama guna, which we translate in English as sentient principle, mutative principle, and static principle. Now, these gunas, the word translates as binding principle. So that we can call them binding forces. And they each of the three work in a slightly different way than the other. But the main thing to note here is they are binding consciousness at the originating phase of the cycle of creation. So we've got those three gunas, sentient, mutative, static. And according to the Tantra viewpoint, everything that comes within the creation is the result of the bondage that these three gunas are placing things under. Okay, so prior to there being a creation, we have these three gunas or three principles in a state of parallelism, flowing in innumerable directions. So they're there, but they're in a state of parallelism. At some point, that parallelism gets lost and a triangle of forces is formed. Now, if this is in a balanced state, nothing effectively changes. They remain within that supreme consciousness. However, something definitely happens if the balance within that triangle of forces is lost, as we'll see in this next slide. So here The three principles, due to their mutual conflict, exert a varying influence on an angular point of the triangle. A resultant force emerges. So that's simply saying where the balance gets lost between these three binding principles, the static, the mutative, and the sentient, then a resultant force emerges from one of the angular points of the triangle, and that within the Tantra viewpoint is the seed of the creation.
Dada?
Yeah.
Would it be fun if we just had just a little dialogue about the physics here for a moment?
Sure.
Just to make it fun. Actually, you know, our work in negentropy is extremely sympathetic to the idea of a supreme consciousness. It actually makes sense from so many points of view. The way, you know, obviously, if you're a scientist, you try not to make assumptions. And so to say there's a supreme consciousness, most physicists would have a problem with initially. But upon examining, actually, what we say is that what enables charge distribution, literally the survival of waves, and ultimately the survival of self-organization among waves, literally the seed of consciousness, means that that which can propagate is only the symmetry that can serve survival, implosion, and negentropy. And ultimately, at the center is where that compression is actually well distributed. That literal survival impulse among waves becomes the seed of self-awareness, literally the seed of creation, which obviously is triangular, and in fact, the static principle versus that which changes, and then eventually that which implodes and becomes self-aware. I'm just saying that there's a lot of language in the physics of negentropy, which is actually supportive to the idea of a supreme consciousness. I would also just say that once we look at the physics, we get ideas like, oh, the presence of that supreme consciousness has some very specific limitations, like in an aluminum building full of electrosmog, the supreme consciousness, that presence is not available because for obvious reasons, whereas in a sacred forest, So you get the idea that once you see the physics behind supreme consciousness, you can actually do the process of embedding and invite it, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I just say that we're very sympathetic from the point of view of physics of negentropy to the idea of supreme consciousness. And so I enjoy the conversation. Please.
Great. Thank you, Dan. That's brilliant. Okay, so this next slide is showing, therefore, we've got these two aspects of supreme consciousness, cosmic consciousness, the operative principle. And we saw in that last slide that the seed of creation expresses, and then we open up the possibility of the cycle of creation. Okay, this next diagram is presenting it as the triangle of forces, with this resultant force expressing. And then from that, we can look at, in terms of the operative principle, according to Tantra, it has two aspects to it. One is an extraversive force, the other is an introversive force. The extraversive force is, we can say, metamorphosing, it is crudifying, it is centrifugal. And we call that in Sanskrit avidya. So that aspect of operative principle is the avidya.
Somebody needs to mute himself. There is noise.
I just did.
Oh, you did? Okay, thank you. Sorry, Dada.
Okay, so and then that same operative principle has an introversive force as well, which is leading things towards subtlety, that is elevating, that is centripetal. And again, in Sanskrit, we call that vidya. Okay, now another name for that operative principle actually is Maya. Some of you will know that word. And therefore, we can talk about Vidya Maya, which is centripetal in its movement and moving towards subtlety and ultimately supreme consciousness. But we can also talk about Avidya Maya, and that will mean the extraversive force. And remember, if you want a creation, you need that extraversive force. You need that centrifugal force, else you're not going to be able to qualify consciousness or a portion of supreme consciousness.
I love it that implosion has a word in that language, which is vidya, which is literally how, centripetal negentry produces self-awareness. And as we say, you need implosion before you can radiate.
Brilliant.
And maybe we can even use the toroidal topology as an example to show the both centripetal and centrifugal forces in one toroidal shape.
Nice, nice.
Right. Thank you, Tufan. Okay, so what is the resultant that comes once the seed of creation manifests? So again, according to the Tantra viewpoint, the first expression is the formation of cosmic mind. Now, Tantra goes into some detail on the structure of that cosmic mind. We don't have time to do that at all now, but let's sort of entertain the idea that the first expression of creation is actually cosmic mind.
Not to interrupt, but the beautiful original book in Theosophy on the origin of what we now call Star Mother Kit was called Mathematics of the Cosmic Mind, and it's literally implosion. So these things seem to fit together, perhaps.
Brilliant. Okay, so as this operative principle working with these three binding principles or three gunas, they start to then work upon let's say, the lowest portion of cosmic mind. And out of that are created what we call the 5 fundamental factors. And these 5 fundamental factors are ethereal factor, ether, aerial factor, space, luminous factor, liquid factor, and solid factor. Now, each of these factors is derived from the factor that went before it. So aerial factor will have been due to the operation of the operative principle on a portion of ethereal factor. And out of that, we get aerial factor, which is then subjected further to the operation of the operative principle, and we get luminous factor, which is subjected further, and we get liquid factor, and finally solid factor. And here the solid factor is considered to contain all the other factors that went before it. And so this is what we call the extraversial phase of the creative cycle. So it's literally gone from cosmic consciousness down through cosmic mind, deriving further into the fundamental factors, and finally down literally to solid factor. Okay, the next slide introduces the idea that as the operative principle / the 3 gunas continue operating on the solid factor, where the intramolecular space has already been compacted and compressed, still that operative force using the binding principles is operating, and the outcome of that continued pressure on solid factor will be one of 2 things, according to the Tantra viewpoint. One is either explosion, whereby that solid object will literally return back to its origins within the 5 fundamental factors from which it derived. Or the second outcome is literally the creation of life. We can say the creation of life at the unit level. So the interesting thing here is that life is considered to actually come out of matter. But how is that logically possible? Because that matter, that solid factor itself, is the condensing of that consciousness. So within it is the potentiality for in a sense for reversion back into consciousness again, but this time at the unit level, the micro level, as a living being. And that's going to happen where the environment is conducive. So where the existing environment is conducive, there's the possibility of the creation of life. And of course, that's going to start off at very basic life form, literally a single living cell.
That might fit the metaphor from liquid to crystal and then back toward liquid crystal, as in DNA, et cetera. So that could, the solid factor being crystal.
Right. Okay, so then we're pretty much going to start on something more or less resembling a type of Darwinian process of evolution. So we've got our singular cells, and then they are increasing in complexity. We're getting multicellular life forms, plant life, animal life. Now, there's two aspects to this. One is the physical vessel, the physical body that is itself evolving over periods of time. But the other thing here is that mind is associated even with a single living cell. So there is rudimentary mind there. And according to Tantra, there is also consciousness in the sense of spirit. Right from the creation of that first single amoeba, that first single living cell. It has physical body, it has mind, and it has spirit or unit consciousness, what we call jiva in Sanskrit. So two things are going to evolve. One is the physical vessel, the body, but the other, very importantly, is the mind itself. So as the physical form is becoming more complex, so the mind inhabiting that physical body is itself expanding. It is becoming more complex to deal with the existence as a more complex being. Okay. Now, eventually, through that process, developed beings arise. And here we can talk about human beings as a species qualifying as a developed being, and of course, non-humans. And at this point, I think it's very, very interesting and refreshing to take account of the exopolitics, intergalactic awareness that is flooding our planet today. So it's not enough to talk about human beings as being the only developed beings. Rather, they are one category of what appears to be a very, very vast category of living advanced beings in our creation.
And now, we have a lot of fun when we think that what we're calling mind from an electric viewpoint, we believe is related to a plasma vortex at the center of a torus. And that as that vortex comes to focus, the children see without their eyes. So the evolution of mind is the increasing size of that vortex, and the skill to increasing the size of that plasma vortex of mind related directly to the idea of Tantra as the ability to grow a bigger aura. And then ultimately very advanced beings, that plasma donut becomes centripetal over the size of things like tornadoes and then stars and then galaxies. So it points directly in the idea toward a cosmic mind as well.
Great. And of course, in this diagram, again, the ultimate movement is back again to merger in the source, in that supreme consciousness.
Yeah, when physics talks about entanglement, and we realize by that they mean embedding, what better introduction to merging with the source?
Right. Okay, so I feel also there's a lot of sort of parallels with the negentropic science that Dan has been presenting.
Exactly.
And that's really why I wanted to go ahead with this, and in the future to see if we can sort of explore further of these parallels and the complementary nature of these two thought systems. Okay, here's another diagram that sort of goes in a slightly different way. It's the same concept, but it's bringing in the sort of astrophysical phenomena within this cycle. So once the solid factor has emerged, then we can get, this astrophysical phenomena right through to black holes. But then shifting focus again from the macro down to the micro scale again, that's when we would be getting the emergence of living beings. Okay, let's jump again to another aspect of this supreme operative principle. So it has both the qualities of having an introversive force, but also an extroversive force. And at the level of living beings, the introversive force will express as Dharma, this concept of Dharma. The extroversive force, which we earlier just related to the Avidyamaya, will relate to the opposite of Dharma, which is Avdharma. So I want to just sort of shift tack and look a little bit at what that's about. So the word Dharma, again from Sanskrit, literally means the fundamental characteristic of an object. A simple example of that is to ask the question, what is the Dharma of fire? What's the fundamental characteristic of fire? Of course, it is that it burns. So if it doesn't burn, it's not fire. So then the question arises, what is the Dharma of humans? What is their fundamental characteristic? What is their fundamental purpose? So according to the ancient yogis, human Dharma has 4 aspects listed here. 1, the expansion of the mind. Human beings want to expand their mind, and they can expand their mind. Second point, they want to bring their mind in a universal flow, in a higher flow than their individual flow. Third point, they want to and they can give selfless service in the world, literally in the universe. And finally, ultimately, they want to merge back into the source from which they came. So this is considered to be the 4 aspects of Dharma, of human Dharma. My personal feeling is this is the Dharma of all developed beings, not simply human beings. Okay, so again, Dharma is relating to the introversive force. Its opposite is our Dharma, that is relating to the extroversive force. Dharma emphasizes the practices for liberation. These are largely the spiritual practices, and selfless service. The Dharma eventually ends up orientating around what we may call black occultism and service to self. So that's by way of contrasting these 2 ideas, and they do link back to that operative principle and its introversive and extroversive qualities. Okay, we can depict that diagrammatically as Dharma being centripetal, moving towards the nucleus. In this sense, the nucleus is the cosmic nucleus, whereas the Dharma force is centrifugal and moving towards periphery, away from the cosmic nucleus, literally from subtlety to crudity. And of course, these words are again similar to what we're hearing in the megantropic science.
Actually,
Okay.
Dada, I just very briefly, I think it'd be fun to, as we've been studying so extensively the physics of successful death, realizing that successful death is an extreme compression event electrically, which is why death visions are contagious. And you can only do that compression literally if you have done selfless service, because you can only get into that charge distribution efficiency, which literally means the wave is shareable. And to enter into that longitudinal array, the collective unconscious, you had to do compression well, and doing compression well means you have to sort all your memories into that which is shareable, namely selfless service. Meaning serving the pure principle of survival of the collective, literally the collective mind. So to embed and do that compression, enter the collective unconscious communion of saints, that physics of implosion of successful death fits perfectly this idea of entering the Dharma. I think the metaphor is very, very nice.
That's great. And I think it's important here to understand, this particular precise meaning of the word Dharma, because it's used widely with certain religions in quite a different sense, where they may talk about Buddhist Dharma or Hindu Dharma. But the real concept of Dharma is universal, the fundamental characteristic of an object. That can be any object. Of course, in yoga, we're interested in human Dharma, particularly in terms of clarifying what our purpose is, how we are to lead ourselves in this journey. And it's fantastic that Dan's bringing in, essentially, as I understand it, the physics of why being serviceful, why being positive, why being happy is actually so critically important. It's not, in a sense, it's not merely a subjective state now. The physics of what Dan has been presenting in so many of his presentations is giving another whole way of understanding why we need to do those things.
And it's great that you called it centripetal. Like after a year of Kundalini, then you have to cry for 3 years until you've done the compression. You got shareable at the center of all service, and it felt like implosion, you know. So centripetal is the right word.
Brilliant. Okay, so this is just bringing in the concept of Dharma within this cycle. So at a more practical and human level, we can then start really talking about Dharma and understanding that there is also the force of our Dharma. And we may say today, effectively, the world from this perspective is actually in the grip of our Dharma. And that poses a certain challenge, which we'll touch on very briefly. Okay, so related to this idea of Dharma, P.R. Sarkar elaborated what he believed were 6 factors that are necessary in order for a society to become dharmic, establish in Dharma, and therefore for human beings to realize their deep dharmic true purpose. So he says there needs to be a viable philosophy around consciousness, around consciousness in the sense of spirit, so we could call it spiritual ideology. He believed there needs to be coherent, effective spiritual practices. There ultimately needs to be a guide, but because the ultimate goal of this cycle of creation, which humans are part of, and which Dharma reflects, that guide will ultimately have to be the supreme consciousness itself. The ultimate guide will be that supreme consciousness itself. Why? Because who else is going to be able to merge a living being into the source from which it came, other than that? Okay. The next factor, the 4th factor, are guidelines. These are the do's and don'ts of how we are to conduct ourselves in our collective. We are living as a collective of human beings, and therefore, naturally, we're going to need guidelines. The 5th point was a viable social outlook. How are we to understand the collective, the society within which we live, and the non-humans that we share our ecosystems with? So that's social outlook. And then the 6th factor is we need a viable socioeconomic system that can provide the material needs of all those living beings so that they may realize their Dharma. Those 4 points again, they can engage in the practices of expansion of mind, coming in this higher universal flow, performing selfless service, and ultimately merging back in the source again. So these were these 6 factors that P.R. Sarkar believed were necessary for a society if they are really going to attain that highest state. And regarding, of course, the spiritual practices, we have here the depiction of the human being, the chakra system. And interestingly, in the base chakra, we have the 4 fundamental longings, as we call them. And they're very interesting, I think, to contemplate. This is showing them as what we call artha, meaning psychic longing, which can provide temporary relief as a human being. It has karma, which is physical longings, Then it has Dharma, which we can then define as psycho-spiritual longing, and ultimately moksha as liberation, merging in the source. These two lower aspects of Dharma are considered to be temporary, so there's no ultimate progress through them. It's only through these primary drivers, Dharma and moksha, that we ultimately get the real progress and that permanent progress. So that's relating back to this base chakra, the four qualities. That's why it is shaped with its four petals. The petals are representing mental propensities in the human being. And again, those four qualities are contained within that base chakra.
You know, Gurdjieff used to talk about charging the battery of yearning, longings from the Sufic perspective. I think it's a lovely metaphor there. Dada, it might be good if you could finish within an hour. I see you have 85 slides, or
no. It's nearly done.
Oh, okay.
We've only got. So here's another way of looking. This is again using the centripetal metaphor. As we're moving as a collective, as a species, to this higher level of consciousness. We're still living in our mundane dimension, our three-dimensional reality, and we have to organize it in a coherent way whereby we as a species are going to be able to make this journey towards this higher state of consciousness. So this is one way of sort of ordering these six factors. So we need viable socioeconomy. Of course, we don't have that today, but we can have it. We need a universal social outlook. We need practical guidelines. Very much we need, from this perspective, an integrated philosophy that's coherent, that's rational, that moves with developments over time in terms of discoveries being made in all fields of human knowledge, including in our fractal physics areas, a philosophy that is expansive enough to be able to accommodate all of these developments.
And once a centripetal physics of spirit, centripetal physics of consciousness, a centripetal physics of soul can be taught at universities and governments, this becomes shareable and spirituality becomes, a universal idea. That's beautiful.
Beautiful, yeah. And then practices, that second last, and then ultimately the guide. Now, guide makes sense when you understand the goal ultimately, according to this, and this is for all living beings, is ultimately merge back in the source. Okay, we've more or less stated that already. When we're clear on what is human Dharma and how it fits within this cycle of creation, then we are clear about what the role of human society is. The role of human society is to facilitate human purpose. In other words, facilitate human Dharma. And I think that's a really super important thing to remember. There was an interesting period in ancient Indian history associated with Krishna, or Sri Krishna, who lived around 3,500 years ago. And many people today are familiar with the word Mahabharata. And this was literally the facing off between Dharma and our Dharma in that particular society, that ancient Indian society. And the name given for that episode in Indian history, where Dharma was facing off against our Dharma in a very dramatic and clear manner, the name given for that period was Mahabharata. And of course, the outcome, it expressed as an actual war and fought on the battlefield of Kurukshetra in present-day Haryana state, just northwest of Delhi. So that's a historical reminder of the fact that these forces are real and ultimately they will have to come to a head. And what we want to see is that the Dharma comes out victorious, which is certainly what happened in that historical episode of the Mahabharata. And then
Dada,
finally,
you just while you're on the picture of the blue beings and maybe Krishna there are some who believe the blue being Krishna story is related to the Andromedans, who are well known for being blue. And in fact, the beginning question of your question on the history of pyramids starts with when the Andromedans and the Federation set up the pyramids for the Lesser Dryad attack 12,000 years ago, which is actually about the blue beings in the Federation versus, which is the story of the history of Thoth, actually, which is where I was going to start. Just point being that there may be a connection between the Indian legends of the blue beings versus the Andromedan story.
Right, that's really interesting. And of course, a lot of people talk about the Vimanas.
Exactly.
And the presence of.
And those are in slides. Exactly. Those stories may fit together very well.
Okay, and then finally we come to this closing slide. 7,000 years ago, in the time of Krishna, we saw again the polarization in that society. This is in the period of Shiva, 7,000 years ago. And again, Dharma and our Dharma polarized and came into conflict. The same thing played out 3,500 years ago with the Mahabharata. And then, according to P.R. Sarkar, today we've reached that same point again, where the Dharmic force is now facing off with the Avdharma force, where the world has actually come under the domination of the Avdharma force. And P.R. Sarkar gave a certain word for this period of history as a way of encapsulating what the real dynamics are. And he gave that name Mahavishwa, meaning the great universe. So what that really means practically is this struggle of Dharma for the centripetal to prevail over the centrifugal. This is now to be played out on a planetary level of our entire Earth planet. But the word Mahavishwa implies actually it's even bigger than our planet, that this process to establish Dharma is to be taken off-world as human beings become a spacefaring species. They let them carry the mission of Dharma. And that is the reason why he chose to give that word Mahavishwa. Of course, a play on the words Mahabharata. So Bharata was the word meaning India, so it was the struggle to establish Dharma in the subcontinent of India. Today, he went so far as to say, for the human species, the mission today is Mahavishwa. It is to establish Dharma, certainly on this small planet, but in becoming a spacefaring species, let it carry the mission of Dharma in all its work. And of course, that's fascinating once you link that in with what we're learning from the exopolitical side about collectives such as the Andromedan Council, which we may see very much as a dharmic organization, as a dharmic entity. The Galactic Federation of Worlds, again, appears to be a dharmic organization. But interestingly, on that point, because it comprises so many races of advanced beings, naturally there's going to be diversities and all manner of things. And the point, I believe, has happened where certain of those advanced species are removed from those bodies because they are not, in this language, coming up to the mark of Dharma. They're not qualifying enough and they may have to get removed. Anyway, this is by way of saying the Mahavishwa idea, I think, fits in very well with what we're learning the exopolitical side of things. And with that, I would like to close and very much thank Dan for his input also. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I really love it that that you put that in the context of where centripetal forces succeed and become negentropic is just another way of saying exactly what you just did. And by the way, the guy that is the hero of centripetal forces, Thoth, his symbol of the caduceus phase conjugation, is literally that implosion. And that's also where our pyramid story starts. So it's all fun. And I love it that you've given that beautiful historical context. And further, I like it that it sets the stage for where the physics of centripetal forces fits the history and the mythology and the Indian context there, whether it's the Vimana or the blue beings. Again, it reminds me of Graham Hancock figuring out that after, probably a lesser dryad, maybe 12,000 years ago, about when we think the pyramids were installed in order to stabilize after the Great War of the Andromedas and the Federation, the hero at that time, Enki Thoth, otherwise known as Hermes, champion of the caduceus, which is centripetal forces, installs the pyramids to be a gravity diode. Well, how do these stories fit together? So, yeah, I think we have a fun context here. Valerie or Tufan, was there anything you want to say before I begin?
I think you all are going great. Thank you.
Yes,
So,
I
you
agree.
okay? Yeah. Okay. Good. Good, Valerie. Thank you. Feel free to interject questions. But I liked when Dada posed a theme here for introducing the physics, the spiritual physics of pyramids, and how does that fit the story of Tantra? First, I would like to say, in a very simplistic but scientific way of thinking about it, the word Tantra, in my view, also and fittingly relates the idea of that which enables an aura, yours and then your lover and then your culture, that which enables the aura to become centripetal and therefore grow and experience that fusion. I mean, there's the classic sexual meaning of Tantra, which is literally the skill to achieve the kind of fusion, whether it's individual or a pair or collective kundalini. It just means the aura has to implode before it gets big, very simply put. And ultimately, that skill to build a big aura fits very well under the term Tantra, I believe. And that ultimately then that aura gets big enough that you will steer tornadoes and stars. And that physics is very teachable in that the plasma tornado that forms inside your head, and we know the frequency signature, it's a caduceus in the brainwaves, literally flameinmind.com. So that golden ratio cascade in brainwaves correlates to when the child sees a tornado vortex form inside their head and suddenly says, oh, I can see without their eyes. Oh, and then they notice, oh, I can see ancestors also. The reason that's the physics of clairvoyance as well is because that implosion, that centripetal force, which relates to what Dada referred to, converts what's called the transverse EMF to that centripetal implosive squirt gun at the Planck threshold, which compresses into the longitudinal distribution, which is the wider aura, called the Ba from the car, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body, literally the physics of soul, predicting electrically who can lucid dream and therefore take memory through death. And the harmonic physics of what triggers lucid dreamings is published in the scientific literature. You can see it on the page on lucid dreaming at therify.net, where we regularly trigger lucid dreaming with that same onset of compression. And the shape of the harmonic series that triggers lucid dreaming, and therefore a soul, which is very, very tantric in my view, it's implosive, was the physics of what that is quite literally the caduceus, which is the hero of our pyramid story. And
may I just ask for a clarification? When you talk about children seeing without their eyes, so they're literally blindfolded.
Yeah.
You talk about there being a vortex and they see through a tunnel. First question I have, is that when the mental waves of the child phase conjugate, mean they're able to embed themselves in a certain way. Are we talking about mental waves, psychic waves that achieve that effect?
Well, you could say that it's mental, but clearly it's not just mental. What we can say is measurable at flameandmind.com is the moment when the children begin to see, they say a tunnel, a vortex appeared inside their head. All of the children say the same thing. So their eyes are closed. They see this pinhole of light through a tunnel, and then they realize that is an eyeball. And that is the physics of consciousness. Nothing else is the physics of consciousness than that plasma vortex, explaining perfectly what you take with you when you lucid dream and when you die, predicting exactly what a soul is the ability to sort waves into phase at the phase conjugate pinhole point, the Planck threshold. And the proof is that it's both a golden ratio and an octave harmonic series in the EEG, flameandmind.com. You can see that whole story. First, we did it with the kids at flameandmind.com/outer vision. And then we showed the same harmonic series, an octave series, the tetracubic, and then a golden ratio series, the dodecacosa. Literally, this lattice precisely forms inside the head measurably in the brainwave harmonics. But this doesn't mean it's stuck in your head. The children often visualize themselves in beautiful nature in order to flip that switch, which is implosive. And it's not just in their head. But that ability is very measurable. And the point being that the same harmonics, except at much higher amplitudes, predicted measurably the moment with Jean-Charles Moyen, repeatedly bilocated with witnesses, documented with science. And we know the physics of that bilocation. That's because you enter the compression of the nodes of that array, which is literally the longitudinal nodes, which in physics is called entanglement, making an Einstein-Rosen bridge, but it's actually the physics of phase conjugation, embedding by impedance matching into the nodes of compression of the longitudinal array. So you only enter and leave those stargates at the compression points, literally, and the Andromedans only set up those stargates. But that's the advanced stuff, where, you know. But the background, it is very, very clear that what causes consciousness is that implosive compression, identical to the measured series of visions seen at the moment of successful death, Heinrich-Klüver form constants, which are exactly the same geometry, the map you see when you die. It's been replicated. So you need that little black hole or you ain't going to get through death.
So the children, in other words, have achieved implosion at the mental level of their mind. Well, by doing certain practices. Can you elaborate?
Yes. If you, the extensive article and extensive films we have on this, flameandmind.com/outer vision. And we've worked extensively with Iris in Netherlands, and Valerie was very involved as well, and Patrick Botti. We have a team on this. But yeah, that's they're basically they make alpha, and then their alpha has to reach all the way to gamma, and that's teachable in various ways, which is basically a trance state. But the classic example is they start by, imagine yourself in beautiful nature. Your body flips the switch and you implode, and suddenly the magic starts. So that experience of compression is identical with the Tantra of growing the aura, which means the donut's getting bigger.
Right.
Dan, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is Didi Radha here?
Sure.
So this implosive compression is also what creates the awakening of the Kundalini?
Yes, and that spectra is more broad spectra. For example, the lower frequency infrasound component of Kundalini is perfectly in phase with that brainwave cascade, but the lower frequency infrasound is called the tidal frequencies of the sacrocranial pump, the true physics of Kundalini. And I actually have a slide on that here, we're going to dig out. But the tidal frequencies of the spine liquid pump, the physics of Kundalini, fit that cascade perfectly. And when those low frequencies are in place, then you have the deeper forms of bliss and literally Kundalini, as it was in my case. And I learned about that, of course, from Benthoff, and we've been teaching the physics of Kundalini for 30 years. But basically, the lower frequencies, by the way, of that process mean, in my case, I get the delta and the very low frequencies very well, which means I can hear ancestors quite often, actually. But The high frequency part of that, the gamma, which the kids reach, I don't quite get there so often. So my clairvoyance is not that good. And my, my seeing without eyes is not that good. And I know why. My gamma hasn't, I don't think I'm young enough or something. But the low frequency component of that, the deep throat Kundalini, that's definitely in my experience. So anyway, but that's all at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. And we have a slide on that coming up. But just to set the stage here, using Dada's questions for my little presentation. So Dada's question, which so helpfully introduces what I was going to say, was a short history of pyramids. When were the pyramids built? And in my view, the pyramids were a gravity diode. And I'm going to explain exactly what that means. Also a global wireless power grid, and also a global physical telepathy mechanism. The pyramids were all of those things set up very specifically related to the team with Thoth, Ea, Enki, and actually what was at that time the Federation, the Andromedans, when they came here to nuke, to have the war with what Elena Danaan calls the Nebu, which at that time was the Greys, the Dracos, and the Reptilians. And that was about 10 to 12,000 years ago, the Lesser Dryad, Great Flood, perfectly fitting Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse story, perfectly. So the only thing Graham Hancock doesn't get is, well, who was that person who came to restore civilization after the Great Flood? And he says, oh, well, was it Oannes, or was it Zoroaster, or was it Thoth, or was it Viracocha, or was it Quetzalcoatl? Oh, those are all names for the same guy, which is actually Thoth, Hermes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, who had a very specific agenda. And so after they blew up the solar system, Mars lost its atmosphere, Tiamat dumped the water that became the Great Flood. So, and this is told in great historical detail by the Andromedans, by the Federation and the Pleiadians. They all say exactly the same story. And you can read that story at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, which is our ET history we've been developing for decades. Point being was, so the pyramids had a very specific function, which I'm calling the Hummer, the gravity diode, and basically an implosive device and a global wireless power grid. And to understand how that works, in my view, is very tantric. And that's where I'm going with this conversation. So are the pyramids worldwide still performing their purpose? Hell no. The Stargate's broken. Why? Well, first of all, they nutated and precessed away from the longitudinal nodes. Oops. And the keystones, it was lapis lazuli at the top, that got moved. No. And the crystal core equipment much of it got removed. So no, it's a mess. But the longitudinal nodes, one of which is where we believe Thoth is still actually in storage below Florida, probably 9 foot tall, probably red-haired. Those longitudinal nodes, which is related to what Elena calls the arcs, are still present, and Enki, Ea, Thoth are back. That's absolutely true. And well, you can look at Elena's work on the cedars in that regard. But remember that Thoth, Enki, Ea is for whom Earth was named, and our red blood, for which they called us Adom, make red, was the first time Enki had seen an iron-based blood. Remember, his blood was green-based, as in fact also was Jean Charles. That was chlorophyll-based. And you change one atom in there, and it goes from chlorophyll to hemoglobin, and that difference is implosive, and that iron gave us an edge. The genetic evolution here meant there was potentially more leverage for bliss, ecstasy, kundalini, and planet star steering with human auras because of that iron-based blood. So Enki was quite enthused, actually, to cook up the Adom Takadama. Anyway, that's the background. So then, unless there's a question at that point, I could start the slideshow. Keynote, implosion, full sequence. Here we go. I got the right one. Star Trek Future. I have the right one. Okay. Are you seeing electrical function of pyramids?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is a slide that also originally I worked with in the presentation, with now has almost 10,000 views, with Sam Osmanagich on the physics of pyramids. And so after this presentation, hopefully, which is quite brief, 20 minutes, you should know why it was called a hummer. It was humming because there was a phase conjugate pump wave named the Schumann harmonic cascade, which piezoelectrically pumped longitudinal inertia into the Earth grid, global wireless power, global wireless telepathy phone calls. And why it's called a gravity diode, because the sinkhole based on golden ratio piezoelectric humming implosion pumped the transverse EMF down the throat of the vortex at the accurate angle to implode it out into a longitudinal wave named a gravity wave and the physics of global wireless power. Tesla had the frequencies wrong, and Tesla had the global nodal locations wrong. Did not succeed because he didn't understand that phase conjugation perfect embedding requires tuning to Planck. And this implosive is actually a seed and plant growth trigger. One of the main purposes of pyramids was literally to cause seeds to grow, which is longitudinal interferometry. What Tom Bearden's book calls gravitobiology is not only the proof that the spit out longitudinal wave is what gravity waves are made of, is what action at a distance are made of, but is what causes plants to grow. Because the same thing that makes gravity centripetal is what makes a seed centripetal, which is the only way a seed can germinate. Practical example. The reason a seed won't grow when the moon gets between the Earth and the sun is very, very basic. It's because the hollow metal moon messes with the longitudinal wave coming from the sun. So you put this copper plate on your roof and a wire to your basement, pitch black basement, and the longitudinal wave arriving in your basement will cause your plants to grow beautifully with no light. But you got to have that longitudinal wave of the sun. But if you put that hollow metal Andromedan moon between the Earth and the sun, no longitudinal wave, and your seeds don't grow. It's pretty fundamental. And so that basic physics also relates to why the hollow metal moon was installed by the Andromedan Federation. And the moon was not here before, after the Lesser Dryad, specifically because our orbit was destabilizing. We were losing atmosphere. And so the function of pyramids as a gravity diode to stabilize was very parallel to the very detailed engineering plan for the installation of the hollow metal moon, precisely fitting the cone between the Earth and the sun. This is not an accident. The Andromedans had been messing with these hollow metal spheres. They're called the Blue Sphere Alliance for, many thousands of years. Anyway, so global wires, plasma projection, et cetera. And the pyramids can serve as plug access for longitudinal charge of propulsion craft. Actually, they used a mercury layer as a lens for that implosive capacitance, which is why there's mercury in so many of the pyramids. And this is the core principle, is that the 76-degree angle, which is at the top of the Russian pyramids and at the base of the Egyptian pyramids, produces a golden ratio cascade, which allows that what's called a phase conjugate pump wave to cause the pyramid to hum, the hummer, to make it a gravity diode, because that phase conjugate pump wave, and here's what it looks like. This is the hum. This is the phase conjugate pump wave. This is the frequency signature which causes the Schumann harmonics, causes the Earth to have stable gravity and atmosphere, causes the frequencies of bliss in brainwaves. It's exactly and only exactly these frequencies. And this is a phase conjugate low frequency infrasound pump wave, the Schumann harmonics, which the pyramid can harness because the piezoelectric component takes that mechanical piezo compression and pumps it down that precise angle here. See this golden ratio cascade of the plasma spheres spitting out a longitudinal wave at the tip of the pine cone, where the pine cones kiss noses. And that, let's see, here are those frequencies in the brainwave harmonics. Here's the Schumann harmonics, top left. Here's the sacrocranial harmonics on the right. And here's the breath harmonics. And here's the alpha, beta, theta brainwave harmonics. And all of these harmonics is one cascade, which is Planck times golden ratio called PlanckFire.com, the cause of gravity, consciousness, life force, and negentropy, successful implosion. The title of my new book, with great help from Tufan Guven, who's with us. And so you can, the more general principle here is that implosion spitting out longitudinal compression at the center.
Can I ask a question then, please?
Yeah, just to say, this slide is the answer to the question about the low-frequency harmonics of the spine liquid pump sacrocranial tidals, which is the physics of that Kundalini, which is exactly, again, the same equation. Go ahead, Dada.
Yeah, so regarding the power grid function of the pyramids, does that mean that there was a global distribution of energy through the various pyramids that were constructed in different parts of the world, or how did that work?
Well, originally, of course, the pyramids have to be at the longitudinal nodes, the dodecaecosa Earth grid, because that's where the distribution is enabled, those compression nodes. And the longitudinal dodecaecosa Earth grid nodes are also where commercial telepathy is measurably possible, where nuclear critical mass is measurably reduced, Bruce Cathy's measures, where every pyramid, cathedral, labyrinth, even therapy, they all work better at those nodes. And why were those nodes the tetrahedral latitudes here? This is from Two-Thirds by David Myers and Davis Percy, which is a Arcturian text. Basically, as you see, if you grab a hold of a gyroscope and you spin it, I don't have the animation enabled here, but if you spin the gyroscope at the right phase angle, you increase the rate of spin. It's called nutate precess in phase. So the shortwave spin of the phase angle of the pump motion is in phase with the longer wave spin, and that cascade of long wave to short wave spins, when it's constructive interference, causes the implosion of spin named gravity. So effectively, if you want planetary spin to remain stable, it must be in phase with zodiacal spin. And that was called planet taming in the Arcturian sense. And that planet taming is part of the agenda of the placement. You have the Mars pyramid nodes, the Earth grid pyramid nodes. They're at what's called tetrahedral latitudes, 19.47 degrees. And that creates a very specific gravity diode function, thus stabilizing gravity and atmosphere, specifically after the global cataclysm, basically. So this is the physics of life, is when these relationship of the long wave to the short wave is phase conjugate by golden ratio, then there's an implosion of spins, which sends the inertia constructively through the speed of light at the Planck threshold, and that implosion is named gravity. And that acceleration of charge towards center, because of implosion through Planck, enables not just stable gravity, but stable atmosphere, which is essential after the Federation just blew up the solar system. Oops. The kids had a problem. How are we going to fix it? So this is literally, this is hermetic science. It is hermetically sealed. So this is modeled by implosive charge collapse. So Kepler actually had it right, that planetary orbitals were a platonic nest, but the reason the planetary orbitals have to be that golden ratio platonic nest is specifically because that charge collapse is the only source of stable gravity, which is literally charge distribution perfected. So enabling that charge implosion. And when those nodes get locked into place in the dodecaecosa here, then when you touch one billiard ball and all the nodes are locked into place, then there is charge distribution in the array because of compression into the stillness. That's why you can talk to your ancestors only if you enter the discipline of compression into the stillness of the nodes of that array. What the Aboriginals called songline dreaming track, we now know as longitudinal coherent EMF interferometry. So this relates to the bigger picture of why the pyramids were related in the physics of these star maps. This is how they set up. The original Orion War was over the Stargate in the heart of Orion. which is tetracubic actually, and that's a double vortex kissing noses, was called Antarian conversion. Here's the geometry of the pyramids, and here's why they're in that geometry, because the Orion star map is literally a double light cone called Antarian conversion. And so this is an old presentation. Actually, these visuals I prepared when I taught Orion pyramid physics, when I set up the video lab at Gaia TV. So that's where these visuals came from, actually. And this system of this fulcrum actually has a name. In Hopi, this is called Peshme 10, 1 less than 10, or the way of the 9. And the Elena has correctly called the return of Enki Thoth the 9. And it has to do with the plasma physics of how plasma self-organizes, and that's a bit of a long story. So the ancients, under the concept of the raising of the Jed, understood that if you created this compression in piezo stone called a Jedi, or the Egyptian Jed, there would be a plasma compression out the implosion cone. And this plasma compression also then was how they built a Shem unto the Lord. The Shem unto the Lord actually were these plasma light bulbs, which now is called Therify.net. The name for that Shem was the fact that, you know, Sitchin called the Shem, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord. He called it a highward firestone, which actually means implosive capacitance, which isn't a bad term, but actually what a Shem is an age reversing electric field. And this was extensively talked about in all the biblical and Sumerian. You know, their problem was premature aging. How did they solve it? They built a Shem unto the Lord. What is a Shem? The Shem is the kind of capacitance which implodes enough to make negentropy literally time reversal. And we now know exactly what that is. And that's, in a way, what Therify.net is, and those plasma tubes in Therify look rather like those plasma tubes from Egypt. So this is just a picture which most of you have seen many times. So when the vortex cone has the correct angle, see the caduceus in blue, then the transverse entering on the left is compressed non-destructively down the translation of vorticity, this spiral on the cone accurately, 10 golden spirals called the caduceus, phase conjugation, and it's spit out at the nose of the squirt gun at the Planck threshold into a longitudinal wave, and the propagation of the longitudinal wave on the bottom, scalar or compressional, is parallel to the direction of propagation, and only that can serve implosive compression. Whereas the transverse component you see here, the transverse EMF arriving at the center will never cause any kind of implosion because it can't be centripetal. It's really quite simple. So only this longitudinal component, and this is an introduction to why Tom Bearden wrote a whole book proving by equation it is the longitudinal wave component, which literally is the gravity wave. And so out the center of that precise angle of vortex, like is in the pyramid, that you can eject charge longitudinally at the throat of the vortex. And that's why there's a voltage difference between the wide and narrow point of the vortex, which is why you can make gravity and electricity with a proper piezo vortex, which is what a pyramid is. And that's the physics of Vimana Hanabu. And basically you take a liquid mercury vortex doped with iron powder, making it red, and the magnetic and hydraulic component are in phase, imploding out the longitudinal nose of that squirt gun, and that's the Vimana Nazi bell. And we have the equations for why that made gravity. If the angle of the spiral on the torus is correct to make that implosion, it actually spits out a longitudinal component at the center. This is all at fractalfield.com/propulsion. Practical example. Only after we developed this new physics of gravity do we know why the famous EM drive worked. Right here's the famous electromotive drive. They bounce microwave in the trapezoidal cavity, and if you optimize the ratio of the frequencies of that microwave, they phase conjugate and implode at the central node, spitting out a longitudinal component named gravity. It is not a mystery how the EM drive works, and in fact, we can optimize it now that we have my equation for how these work. This is just this is old. I think Valerie's probably a little bored here. She's seen these too many times. But see, I grabbed a hold of that gyroscope, and if I get the phase angle right and pump it, that gyroscope will spin very fast. And that relationship of the phase of the long wave of the short wave relates precession angle to solar system spin angle to Earth spin angle. When those spins are perpendicularly in phase, that conjugate implosion stabilizes gravity and atmosphere, and that was the ancient art of planet taming. That's what that book is about, 2/3. This is how the...
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question, Dan?
Sure. In fact, I'm going to stop the share now because I've gone too fast. So I'm going to stop the share. You go right ahead. Please do. I went too fast.
Is the implication of understanding the implosive cause of gravity that it opens up the possibility for anti-gravity technology?
Absolutely. Oh, sure. Yes, yes. It's electrogravity, electrogravitics, which is implosive capacitive by definition. Once you know that the acceleration of charge towards center caused by phase conjugate fractal implosion, the only definition and name for gravity is only that acceleration of charge towards center. So once you know the cause of that acceleration of charge towards center, all physicists agree that charge collapse is a cause of gravity. Until me, they didn't know the cause of charge collapse. The cause of that charge collapse is PlanckFire.com. You take Planck times powers of golden ratio, you have Planck fire, that causes implosive charge collapse, and that spits out the longitudinal component at center, which travels at golden ratio multiples times the speed of light, which is the smoking gun here, the cause of gravity. And that embeds into the array. And that's also the physics of entanglement and all action at a distance. And you can actually do longitudinal interferometry and microwave, and you can do heat containment at a distance, like, you know, Ingo Swann made a flame with his mind, you know, and his golden ratio and brainwaves. And that's how you can do heat containment for fusion energy. It is the holy grail of all fusion energy. What is heat containment at a distance? So if these physicists would get their thumb out of their and stop calling it entanglement in Einstein-Rosen bridge and use the correct term for entanglement, which is the embedding perfected by phase conjugation, they could actually understand action at a distance and stargates and wormholes and lucid dreaming. And you can't understand anything about any spiritual story anywhere until you know the physics of action at a distance. If you're sitting there watching an Aboriginal, he's moving the clouds 100 miles down the road on the song line with the image in his mind. That is longitudinal interferometry. They called it Dreamtime Songline Dreaming Track, but actually it's coherent longitudinal emissions from the body's aura, the only physics of soul.
Can I ask another question then, Dan? When
Please
you
do.
showed the picture of the Nazi bell,
Yeah.
So the idea that somehow the Nazis had engineered an anti-gravity device,
Oh, yeah.
would they have been using the same understanding, the same physics as what you are developing?
Well, you know, the crude extraterrestrials even today are still using that Mercury vortex Vimana, and the Nazis were studying the Vimana, but then they got help from the Pleiadians and others. But what you have to do, if you take the Mercury and you got two spinning cylindrical drums, very high speed, in a vacuum, and now that mercury is doped with a special wetting agent, making iron powder soluble, enabling magnetic flux density inside the hydraulic density. And now that implosion, mechanically, hydraulically, and magnetically, is imploding, spitting out a longitudinal at the center, and makes a lot of power and a lot of gravity. And it's dangerous and nasty and crude. But the Nazi Dark Fleet used that for decades. They did time travel, they made messes. And even after they got kicked out of here with the Nebu Grays and Dracos, they went to Aldebaran, and there's still a problem out there. So the problem ain't over.
But presumably they upgraded their technology so they didn't have to rely on mercury.
Well, for decades, they were sticking a mercury vortex inside a submarine. That was the first craft they took to the moon and Mars. And they made messes there too. But read, you know, Tony Rodriguez' Dark Fleet series, Colony Cavalier. This is very detailed, and I did 2 detailed interviews with him, actually, on the Nazi Dark Fleet.
Thank you.
Can I jump in for a second then?
Please do.
So Dan has successfully explained the physics of stabilization of gravity and atmosphere through the distribution of nodes on the Earth on a geometric pattern, and also through specific angles of pyramids to allow the distribution of a universal frequency cascade through the pyramids. And these are all this is a great understanding of the physical mechanics of waves. But I wanted to emphasize here the distinction between the external and the internal, because these were part of the external physics. But as we all know, aligning the internal discipline with the external discipline is key for a successful, let's say, a Kundalini experiment. And I wanted to suggest a great tool to practice this internal discipline. Now, I'm sure there are many ways of practicing this in different traditions, but one of them is the flame in mind application, where you can scientifically watch your frequencies of your brain waves and see how they are aligned with this same frequency cascade that Dan has been talking about, that were being created also through the pyramids with the 72 degrees and so on. And I also wanted to point that out, because when we all talk about the external physics, people may ask, like, how can we integrate this in our
beautiful, very, very appropriate. Thank you for bringing us back to something practical as well. And I would point out that, you know, the few $100 for the brainwave device, flameinmind.com. However, the infrasound, low frequency infrasound binaural bliss audio component, which is the only motor for Therify, Quantify, Plasma Fire, Piezo Fire, they all use that same perfect implosion infrasound audio. Those binaural audios are available for, you know, like less than $20 if you just buy the Flame in Sound app part of flameinmind.com. And that Bliss binaural audio is a powerful trigger, and it exactly fits what Tufan is saying. Yes, it's nice to measure brainwave, but you can get simpler than that to start with. And also, that infrasound is anchored on the most important low frequency in the blood, called the Mayer wave, 10-second, 0.1 hertz, a 5-second in, and that the breath to make that low frequency Mayer wave is a perfect tool to initiate that implosive infrasound, the Mayer wave 10-second breath, which is the only thing heart math calls heart coherence, just that 10-second wave. But that's a perfect foundation building block. So with the breath tool, along with the brainwave tool, along with the Bliss binaural tool, any one of those tools, and that directly embeds the spine liquid pump and therefore the brainwave cascade. So yes, there's fabulous, powerful tools for all this. And part of this, again, is, you know, it is important to emerge from the electrosmog metal building hell and a little access to nature so that you get a shot at imploding a little of that Schumann, which is the embedder for all of this. So thank you, Tufan. Yes.
So the frequency signature is the same in all parts of the universe, frequency of implosion. So we are very fortunate to have the physics now, and thanks to Dan. And so we can also, we have tools to practice.
Yeah. Planck is the same for 1,000,000 light years in all directions, and the Planck multiples that make hydrogen, which is the reason. And you take the same cascade that is hydrogen, golden ratio times Planck, and you get Schumann, brainwave, Bliss, Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, precessional year. So this is not a local phenomena. No, pure implosion, and the implosion frequencies, which Hermes called the caduceus, is absolutely a universalizing principle, meaning that once we understand the origin of that negentropy, the origin literally of cosmic mind, how wonderful that when Plummer wrote the book, Mathematics of the Cosmic Mind, which became the Star Mother Kit, and he then wrote the intro for the Star Mother Kit for us, what Theosophy called the Mathematics of the Cosmic Mind is literally the perfect implosive Platonic nest, which we now know is literally not only exactly how the electron shells become the atomic table, tetracube, dodecacosa, and how the protons and neutrons, the hadrons, that's exactly how that becomes a nucleus, and that's exactly how bliss happens in aura, and that's an exact predictor of planetary orbital radii. Namely, that golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. If that was ever a smoking gun to how you make gravity. So this principle, which I call PlanckFire.com, is so universal. If we obey the laws of negentropy, for example, if you look on our peaceuniversity.net, the physics of all peacemaking is literally directly the result of that negentropy. The only definition of peace is actually the stability that's enabled by conjugate implosion, because it's the only definition of stability, actually. So gravity maintenance and peacemaking are the same thing. So when Phil Callahan showed that you could predict where war is going to break out when you measure where the magnetic lines broke, what do you have to do to make peace? Oh, make the magnetic lines look like a rose again. I mean, dodecacosa. And suddenly peace breaks out. If ever there was an elegant definition of peacemaking, and then village A can feel village B, and that's been measured.
So also today's subject lines of this conference, Tantra and pyramids, fit perfectly to this internal and external frequency signatures. So thanks.
Tantra being that centripetal force to enable that aura to grow, literally. And the growth of that aura is the growth of mind, because it makes the tornado bigger that you're steering. You know, you weren't destined to just steer tornadoes on this planet. No, there's tornadoes between stars that desperately need steering. In fact, stable star birth requires the birth of consciousness. This was an advanced Sufic concept that planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically. What did they mean by that? That means that our concept of feeling, that literally intelligent plasma, is designed to grow up and become star inhabiting. So until you've inhabited the local star with your aura, you know, you're stuck in a kindergarten a long way from downtown.
Dada, some questions on the chat room.
There's
Go
a question from no.
Go ahead.
About gravity. We know Krishna. Namaskar.
Well, I'll start with the last one.
Electrical engineer by training, have there been any experiments done to validate the electrical signals caused by gravity, and any relation of gravity to the science of microbiota? And maybe Krishna, you would like to say something about it yourself.
Well, I mean, we can say...
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, well, we can say that gravity wave measurement, we now know, is essentially capacitive coupling. And so when Hodowanik and Ramsey measured gravity waves with 20-cent capacitors, better than Weber's billion-dollar gravity waves, than the LIGOR. Yes, gravity waves are measured, and it is Tom Bearden's equation for longitudinal interferometry. And longitudinal interferometry is the result of phase conjugation, which conventional physics calls entanglement, which we now know, when perfected, is called perfect nesting or conjugation. So implosion is by definition that gravity. So yes, the electrical signals caused by gravity have definitely been measured, to the extent that we now know how to measure longitudinal waves, which unfortunately most electrical engineers haven't figured out, but the advanced electrical engineers. Let me give you an example. So when, you know, the famous, as we talked before, as the famous Princeton Noosphere project, they used what they call the Josephson junction, which is capacitive coupling. And they measured when 3,000 people died on 9/11, it set up a gravity wave. They measured that. They didn't know that that capacitive coupling was measuring longitudinal interferometry. So there are much simpler examples that, for example, if you conjugate microwave, you make gravity. If you conjugate capacitance in a piezo water vortex, you make gravity and power, all because you are imploding charge through the speed of light using golden ratio phase conjugation. So clearly we know electrical signals caused by gravity. Very simple example. If you take the electrical signal that is the structure of hydrogen and you multiply Planck times golden ratio, and you get exactly that electrical signature of hydrogen radii, the first real proof of the fractality of hydrogen, how and why hydrogen makes gravity. That's the first publication in my new book, PlanckFire.com, which is Electrical Signal Caused by Gravity. Another example is when famous Raymond Chow measured golden ratio times the speed of light is the dominant measurement of hundreds of measurements faster than light speed. So if the faster than light speed center around golden ratio times the speed of light, we have the smoking gun that I am right of how gravity is caused, and that's the electrical fingerprint, golden ratio times speed of light. Second question, any relation of gravity to the science of microvita? You folks well know that I love it that Ananda Marga is focused on ideas around life force. I, however, am focused entirely on measurement. So and fortunately, from my study, I haven't seen where microvita has been measured. So I simply cannot comment. What I can say is after 30 years of commercially measuring life force, which we now do commercially around the world, at flameinmind.com/light-force. And the article about that is goldenmean.info/measuring life force. I'm putting it in the chat window, and you can read about my lifetime of work measuring life force. But I'm in agreement with the philosophy of Ananda Marga that life force is nodal, it's electrical, and it is in fact quantized. I think we agree on that. But of course, I am very clear that it's quantized by Planck.
Because many people in the audience don't maybe know about microvita, would you say something about it, Krishna or Dada or anyone else? What does it have so unique that it's contradicting this?
Well, if I can make a comment, you know, I've asked Dan about this in other occasions, and his sort of reply, which I very much respect, was around the idea of if it's not measurable, then it's difficult to engage with it.
That's right. You can't discuss it, really, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, you know, I put the ball back in the side of the people involved in microvita research to do that. And the good news is that some people are doing practical experimentation. One of them in the United States, and I look forward to seeing what practically emerges from that.
Great.
So anyway, that's a strange reply in a sense, but I appreciate Dan's very empirical, practical, measurable approach to all of this. And even though the language is complex, after listening a lot of times to a lot of Dan's videos, it's starting to fall into place. And I'm finding parallels actually with many things from Tantra, including meditation, because, you know, the biofeedback that Dan talked about earlier and Tufan talked about, you know, I'm just waiting to get access to a biofeedback machine as a meditator to see what effect it can have on me being able to increase my degree of concentration and what we call ideation in the meditative state. So I feel that there's going to be really a contribution of this sort of science and technology, as Dan and others are exploring, on the actual subjective experience of what we call intuitional practices or spiritual practice. And that's fantastic.
Beautiful. And in fact, that is our great yearning right now, is to have more facility, especially where young people can see the moment when they get coherent alpha in their brain waves. That's when they begin lucid dreaming and have access to bliss, basically, which is, you know, the Tibetan Gamma. It all fits. The brainwave measurement is the beautiful synergetic tool to precisely the spiritual wisdoms you teach. It's perfect.
And another factor would be the role of mantra being so central in the Eastern spiritual practices. So many of the meditations were using mantra. And of course, mantra ultimately is sound vibration. So exactly. What's happening then is through sound vibration, we may presume that a type of implosion can be achieved within the array of the mind, which leads to the trance state, or ultimately the samadhi state, where the mind literally absorbs into its subject being the soul or the unit consciousness.
That's wonderful. And in fact, here's that article, goldenmean.info/harmonic, where you can see the frequency signature of a well-pronounced Om is precisely a high Om. Infrasound implosion. That's what it is, which is access to that still point, which is perfectly introduces the physics of mantra. Exactly. That's the seed sound. Beautiful.
And I've also...
Can I say something? I just wanted to say that it also connects with the concept of Dharma, because this coherence of brain waves really happens more and more we follow Dharma. Means more and more we become Dharmic people, and more we have this mind coherence that then brings to bliss and all these other altered state of or higher state of consciousness is totally connected with the practice of Dharma.
Yeah, exactly. And that also fits the idea that the more you embed the long wave, the more you can have longer goals and intents.
Mm. Yeah. Right.
You were saying something else, I think, Dada, were you?
Well, what's coming to mind when you've spoken about the magnetic lines being affected by the emotional states of the human beings around those areas. I think you've talked about the underwater, water underground is even affected by the emotional states of the human beings of those areas. Can you say something a little bit about that?
Well, it's famous in geobiology, thou shalt not sleep over a water vein. You know why? It's really quite simple. It's the same reason your children will want to pee when they hear a living river, because the water inside will want to join the water outside. So if you sleep over a water vein, your aura is going to want to go with it. And actually, that's not a good thing. Actually, sleeping over water in general. But water veins can convey magnetic lines, but having people spend time over water veins is classic geobiologic no-no. But the key is that the magnetic array determines whether you have access to the grid, which is the collective unconscious ancestor memory. That's what it is. That's what a Dreamline song track. So the famous story was, well, first, to find out who's sick in your house, make a magnetic map of everybody's bed. And then you make a magnetic map of the house, and then your yard, and then your village. And then rearrange all the magnetic maps to look like a rose, and you're done. And they actually did that in Bohemia, by the way. The magnetic map of the village was color-coded on the city streets, and you could see where the rose was broken. Oops. And Prague's magnetic map is a rose. It's famous, and they attract money and tourists. It's very simple. And you know why? Because the original Prague is a volcanic caldera, and that meteor was a meteoritic caldera. So that meteoritic was trace mineral rich and made a fractal rose-like grid. And that's also why the famous Ohio Serpent Mounds work is the meteoritic caldera, and also Valerie's birthplace in Sweden.
So Dan, when you talk about lack of permission to touch, can you explain that?
Well, the classic story is when the Wilhelm Reich Orgone James DeMeo paper, Desertification and Patriarchy, rather proved that the spread of patriarchy causes the spread of deserts. The physics is that if you watch a child put a hole in a cloud, what they're adding to that cloud with their conscious focus, which is capacitively implosive, is the permission to touch, which enables water vapor to form a droplet called Christos. It's literally crystallization, both in physics and magic. So that seed of electrical centripetal force, which is literally the electric origin of consciousness itself, is what creates the symmetry conditions necessary for implosive capacitance, which is the only time water vapor can form droplets. So as magnetic lines fractionate, classically, rain will go away. It's very simple. goldenmean.info/rain, goldenmean.info/labyrinth. So permission to touch for waves is permission to touch for culture. So obviously, in a culture where the young people have no permission to touch, it's measurable, it's documented, it causes the formation of deserts. And this needs to be understood in the sense that the clouds will not want to touch land where children cannot touch. Is this a lesson for Britain? No, I mean, no, the reason we have football players and football injuries is because the kids have no permission to touch. Oops, this was called the poison pellet syndrome, the Jungian analysis of the Balinese cockfight, which is the origin of football. You have to push out the poison pellet named football if your kids have no permission to touch. Oops, because the urge to touch, frustrated, becomes anger by definition. This has been an ad for the National Football League. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay, so Valerie, is there any other questions there?
How are we doing? Was that a happily ever after? Almost.
I think with yes, the idea of making rain. For me, we had terrible drought here, and it was really concerning. And I thought, okay, so we have friends, geobiologists, dowsers, and so on, so sorcerers. So we came together, and I thought more than looking for rain was more to bring people together, and this was more the result. And the result is that now we have rain, which was very. We were very concerned, and we really thought we would never get it back. There were some predictions that we still have to work on it, but we cleared some places. So there is some amazing knowledge around it.
We made labyrinths, and then our partners, Jan particularly, knows all the local elementals and dragons by name, So if you make peace among the elementals and you make some labyrinths, you make centripetal force. And there's all those stories where at goldenmean.info/rain. And Valerie's right. That permission to touch happens to be feminine. So I think we want to thank everybody very, very much here. We thank Valerie for conceiving and inviting. Thank Dada for being so open to the connection between science and spirit. And we're happy to make this a shareable wave. Thank you. Anything further, Dada? And Tufan?
Yeah, and thanks also for Tufan's presence with us. Yes. I've listened to a number of Tufan's videos, and I really appreciate his ability to sort of bring it down to a manageable level for us. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, that was a good summary, Tufan. Thank you. And Valerie has even honored us with her smile now. This is all wonderful. Thank you, guys. We'll have to do some more of this. We'll have more fun like this.
That was great.
Wonderful.
We're becoming a shareable wave.
Everybody who came. Thank you for Krishna and Marisol came. Dharmaputra, Radha, Didi, Radha.
Yeah, thank you, Vikashi. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Valerie, Dada, and Dan and all others. I'm very happy to be here and hope to see you guys soon.
Yes, we're happy to share. Blessings. We send peace and bliss to all. Thank you. Called Ananda, as in Ananda Marga. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
See you soon.